And welcome, welcome, welcome. This is Peter Winnick. I'm the founder and CEO of Thought Leadership Leverage, and you're joining us on the podcast today, which is Leveraging Thought Leadership. Today, my guest is Stephen Kraus. Stephen is one of the world's leading experts on consumer insights and digital trends. He's currently the head of digital insights for JumpShot, which is a rapidly growing startup that delivers digital intelligence from within the internet's most valuable walled gardens. He's the author of 3 books and dozens of articles. Prior to JumpShot, he ran several industry-leading research studies, including the Ipsos Affluence Survey and the Yankovic Monitor. He has a PhD in social psychology from Harvard and taught psych and stats at his alma mater, the University of Florida. So welcome aboard, Stephen. How are you?
I'm great, Peter. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It's great to be here. I'm kind of a fanboy of your podcast, so it's exciting to be here in person.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. So let's talk for a minute. You know, your background is really interesting, right? You've got the academic piece, heavy research piece on the corporate side, and then now JumpShot. And there is sort of a thread of the thought leadership and content, but maybe talk a little bit about how you were using thought leadership earlier in your career, you know, books and such, and sort of where that fits in now. Because I think a lot of people have trouble sort of dealing with that or managing
Yeah, I started out more years ago than I would care to admit in
that.
in academia. I have a PhD in social psychology from Harvard University, and I taught, as you said, when I got out of graduate school for a couple of years, teaching a lot of research methods and statistics and psychology. You know, I've always been interested in what makes people tick. Why do people do what they do? And so my training in the social sciences was then kind of a good jumping off point to kind of go into the world of market research, survey research, polling research. So, among other things in that world for a while, for about 6 years, I was running a study called the Ipsos Affluence Survey, which had been tracking the lives and lifestyles of affluent Americans for more than 40 years. And so that was also a really interesting data set to be thinking about how has income concentration changed society? How has it changed, every marketplace, not just luxury ones. So I wrote a couple of books on affluence. I did a lot of speaking. I gave a TED talk, and I've always loved telling stories with data. And one of the things that I've tried to do in my career is tell interesting stories about consumers or digital trends as a way of kind of drawing in interest from other companies. So now that same storytelling with data is what I do here at JumpShot, and we've got this amazing, great data set that's based on over 100 million devices in our panel, that we have a really good comprehensive view of what it is that people are doing online. And so we study that digital behavior to really kind of distill what are the consumer insights? What do we learn about people that companies might be able to use to connect more effectively?
Sure. So I want to split those into two themes for a moment, right? So the data piece and the storytelling piece, right? So first off, unlike many that come from academia, where they're so sort of embedded in that academic way of thinking and dealing with data and all that sort of stuff. Some of the problem that those folks have, I'm making a general statement here, is they can't convey or clearly communicate what the it is because they're not so good in storytelling. So why don't we start with, how do you take, any form of content that you can tell in a story form, which by the way is every form of content, has a much higher probability of having resonance with folks. So can you tell me how did you get over your academic self to become an articulate storyteller?
Well, for me, the transition from academia into more of the corporate world was relatively easy because I'd been really interested in studying consumer behavior,
Okay.
and the behavior of people in general. And really, in getting kind of formal training in the social sciences, you learn the scientific method. You start out with a hypothesis. Well, how are we going to test this? You collect some data, and then you have to analyze the data and go back to your original hypothesis and figure out if that was right. And that's really the same process whether you're doing scientific research or if you're a company trying to better understand how to connect with consumers. So the process is the same of collecting data and making data driven decisions. And like you said, we have so many clients who say we have so much data, but we don't know what to do with it, and we don't know what it says. Sometimes I say people are drowning in data, but they're starved for insights.
Right. I mean, that's where I wanted to go is that sometimes, we're living in sort of we have the opposite problem that every generation prior to us had, which is we're flooded with information where everybody else was sort of information starved. That being said, we need that insight. We need that. And I think that's where the storytelling comes in. So could you give any, some folks a specific example or maybe a tactic or something on some of the things that you do to be able to take it from sort of two-dimensional numbers on a spreadsheet to a story that actually connects emotionally, to folks, that gets people to really, really lean in at more than a numerical level.
Yeah, I'll give you an interesting example, and it comes from Nike. So obviously a very
Okay.
very well known brand. They announced to a lot of fanfare a year or so ago that they were going to start selling directly on Amazon. Now, in this day and age, it's basically impossible for a company to not have a presence on Amazon. So
Sure.
if you had gone to Amazon and searched for Nikes, you would find Nikes, but they were being sold by resellers or wholesalers, and maybe they were authentic and maybe they weren't, and maybe they
Yep.
provided good customer service and maybe they didn't. So Nike came along, and there were a lot of headlines around this idea of, oh, Nike's going to start selling directly on Amazon. But was what was really interesting to me was that was actually part of a larger initiative by Nike where they were trying to sell as much directly to consumers as they could. They wanted to, maximize their profits. They wanted to have a stronger relationship with their customers. So the question becomes, well, how do you do that? And so for a brand like Nike, they are strong enough where they can have their own branded website, nike.com, and they can have
Yep.
their flagship products at flagship margins because their true enthusiast fans will find them there. But at the same time, so much traffic is coming through Amazon, you can't ignore that. So they have a different set of products and a different portfolio at different prices on Amazon. So they're really trying to tackle this classic business marketing channel optimization challenge, but you really need a tremendous amount of data to do that right. You have to understand how many people are coming to your website, how many people are then going to competitor websites, how many people are going to your site but then leaving before they buy anything and then going over to Amazon and buying the exact same thing. And the fact is that most companies just don't have access to this kind of information. If you're, a Nike, again, just to continue the example, you have a pretty good idea of what happens on your website, but you really don't have a great idea of what happens on competing websites. And you have some idea of what happens to your brand on Amazon, but Amazon plays that kind of data very close to the vest, and it's very hard to get, competitive context. Are you doing well? Are you doing not well? What keywords are converting? So, there are all these kinds of very specific challenges that really require data to make the right kind of decisions. So Nike is kind of one of these examples. And really, everything I just said in this Nike Amazon example, you could say the same thing for hotel and travel
Of
brands
course.
and the OTAs. It's the same kind of thing. They want to sell as much directly to consumers as they can, but they can't ignore the online travel agencies and the Expedias of the world. So they need data to figure all this out. Where are people going on the internet? What kind of data really what kind of information really attracts them?
Got
And
it.
how can you build a website that people are going to want to go to and transact and really engage with, and not go over to Amazon? So
Got it.
there's a lot of kind of looking at what are the broader patterns of consumer behavior that then kind of informs a lot of very specific marketing actions.
Got it. So I want to pivot for a moment into books because you've survived the writing of three as well as articles. So talk a little bit about the difference between what it takes to get a book out into the world today versus your first book, and how you go about that differently, both from a creating the content perspective to getting it out there to validating that this is the book you should write versus the 10 others you have in your mind. Talk us, because everybody's got a different sort of process.
Yeah, I've written three books. So my first book was self published. It was kind of a scientific self help book, for lack of a better phrase. But because I've always been interested in self improvement and goal setting. But again, I'm a data driven guy, and there's so much research being done now in the field of positive psychology and other areas, really looking at, well, what do the data tell us about happy, successful people? And that was then kind of a transition into my other two books, which were really about studying affluent Americans and what do they do differently, and how is kind of the face of affluence changing. If you looked at America back in the 50s and 60s, if you looked at the list of richest Americans, they all had the same last names. It was the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the DuPonts. And now our economy has completely changed, and now wealth by and large is created within one generation by this new generation of entrepreneurs. And so I wrote a couple of books about how do people get wealthy? How does that change them? What is it like to be wealthy, after kind of, growing up middle class and having a long period of comfortable affluence? And then often real wealth comes very quickly with a liquidity event.
But touch on a little bit of, you mentioned the first book is self-published, and then sort of where the next one went, and maybe compare and contrast the experience of self-published to not self-published.
Yeah, there are trade offs on both fronts. I was really passionate about the content that I was writing about for my first book, that scientific self help book, and a lot of the traditional publishing world said, well, that market is too crowded right now, and it's hard to break through. And what's going to be different about your book? And I said, well, it's really based on scientific research. And they said, yeah, the science thing. I don't know how widely appealing that is, and you know, I I think times have changed. Publishers have a very different reaction, but at the time, and this as well. I mean, there was a time when people self-published books because they couldn't quote unquote get a real publisher.
Right.
Now, I think people self-publish either because they couldn't get a real publisher or they don't need a real publisher. They've got their own platform.
Let me throw a couple of other ors in there. So it doesn't necessarily mean, and I would argue in many cases, it doesn't mean at all that they couldn't get a traditional publisher. It could also be they want to control the timing, right? They don't want to be in an 18 to 24-month cycle. They want more control over the content and those sort of things and the derivative products. It could also be a business decision, right? Because the reality is, in most cases, if a book does wildly off the charts well, that's okay for the author. If the book just does okay, it's a loser for the author under a traditional model, right? Non-traditional model, if you believe your book might be a slow drip, like, hey, I'm out there speaking, I'm out there doing things, I'm out there whatever, I might sell X number a year for Y years. It might just be a margin decision. So I think there's a lot more variables that I think people need to put into it. Going back to your example of the first one, and the reason you went to self-publish is, the publisher said, well, there's really not a market for that, or that's crowded. In essence, by going your own way, you said, no, but I still want to do this. I still believe that this is content that is valid, that needs to be out there. And history has shown that you're right.
Yeah, and that first book that I self-published was a great business builder for me as I went out, and I had a platform. I was out speaking. I had an opportunity to, sell products in the back of the room, and just the credibility of being an author. So then, when I, kind of was getting ready for the next book, it was so much easier to go to a publisher and demonstrate, look, I've written this book. Here are the sales I've been able to produce for it. Another thing that's changed in the publishing world is that years ago, publishers provided a lot of marketing support, and now they pretty much don't. And so a lot of authors today are saying, well, if I'm going to have to do all the work of marketing, I might as well keep all the profits from the book.
Yep, yep. So I want to touch for a minute on your day job, right? And how it is beneficial to both you and the organization that you come to the table with a body of thought leadership and content as a acknowledged expert in the field. So could you talk about how you're using it sort of in service of jump shot in your own career, how it's been helpful to you? Well, because you've invested a ton of time and energy and resources into creating great stuff.
Yeah, well, at Jump Shot, I said we have this amazing data set, and I love to tell stories with data. And I think that right now in the corporate world and the startup world, there's a growing recognition that thought leadership can be really valuable for building brand awareness. If you go to any startup now, they're going to have a department of demand generation or demand gen. And so that's a group of people, and all they're doing is try to, bring more leads into the funnel. They're trying to nurture those leads. And so if you go to them and say, well, we've got this great thought leadership. Here's this great new white paper on topic X. Here's, I'm going to do a webinar on, what are the digital trends coming up in the year 2020. There's a tremendous amount of interest because there's actually been some really interesting research by LinkedIn and a research firm called Edelman studying how influential thought leadership research is. And so they survey business to business decision makers and find that a huge and growing number of them look to thought leadership, that before they make a decision about products or services that they're going to buy, they are out reading white papers, they're listening to webinars. That
So let's compare that just from a return on investment perspective. I'm a company. I want to get your attention because you are a representative client or potential client or customer. So I've got a couple options. Or I can go the traditional marketing route, right, and hope to get your attention. Lots and lots and lots of noise there. Or, and I think this touches on your point of the trend in the business side of thought leadership. I could use thought leadership as a way to differentiate, cut through the noise, get your attention. It's a little bit of a slower time from awareness to call to action. But what people are finding and organizations are finding, it's worth making investments into experts inside the firm, be that the CEO or someone like yourself, in an ongoing investment in thought leadership, which actually gets measured on a return basis from through the marketing lens.
The way I think of it is, we try to produce interesting content about digital trends and what's going on in consumers' minds, and that in telling that story, we kind of Trojan horse in our sales message. So a lot of companies will produce a lot of ebooks and such that are basically, here's our product. Our product is great. Buy our product. Or here's a lot of data, but it is so much more compelling. And like you said, just cuts through all the clutter to come out and say, here's an interesting trend that you have to know. Here's how the world of e-commerce is changing. That, with some of our data,
Yep.
70% of online transactions happen behind these walled gardens like Amazon, where you can't get visibility into them. So if we can go out and tell an interesting story about that, or about that Nike example that I gave you, implicit in all that is, well, you actually need the data to execute on
Yep.
that. And so then, where do they get the data? They could come to Jump Shot.
Well, and I would also say, I mean, you mentioned sort of you sort of bake the sales piece into it. There are often times that you're putting content out there where you're not specifically selling through every piece of content that you ever put out into the marketplace, but you're being generous and giving to the folks that are of most interest. Like, your content is only incredibly valuable to people, specific people in a specific field, right? This is not, you're not competing with Procter and Gamble marketing dollars for new moms or whatever. Like, who it resonates with. So if you can constantly be
Yeah.
of service to those that you can eventually service, that's really the win.
Yeah, you hit it exactly right on the head. Is to produce interesting ideas and insights, and to do that over and over again in different ways, and to recognize that not every piece is going to have an immediate sales impact. And so one of the things that we try to do, and of course there's always the question of, well, what's the ROI on thought leadership?
Yep.
How do you know that it's working? And we think that it's really important to look at how thought leadership is connecting with our customers and our prospects throughout the sales funnel.
Yep. So you're mapping it specifically with your marketing folks to sort of the prospecting conversion, all the sales funnel process and having the appropriate content hit folks in the right part of the journey.
Exactly. And so we're able to look back and say, oh, well, here's, this big new six-figure account that we just got. How did they come to us? Well, they first came to us by downloading a white paper,
Yep.
but then it wasn't just that. Then they listened to this webinar. Then they did this other thing. And, they engaged with us 3 different times before they ever talked to a salesperson.
In 3 different times and in potentially 3 different modalities. So it's never a one shot, one deal sort of situation.
maybe sometimes they get drawn in by the snackable little infographic
Yep.
that went out on social media, and then they wanted more, so they listened to a webinar, and then they downloaded the 15-page white paper, and then they wanted to talk to a salesperson. So, it's nurturing those relationships with interesting ideas and value that, like you said, really cuts through the
So
clutter.
I love it. So as we start to wrap up here, any final nuggets for folks? Definitely think about doing this and definitely stop doing that. Or what would you tell folks that are on a thought leadership journey, particularly in an enterprise business where they're looking to, really be thoughtful about how they do it and the investment that they're making?
Yeah, how to be thoughtful about thought leadership?
Yeah.
I would say you need to have some really good thoughts, that you need to have some interesting things to say. And so I would encourage people to be bold and go out there and make some bold statements and some bold predictions. I was mentioning that study that LinkedIn and Edelman done about thought research, about thought leadership, and one of the things that they found was that companies look at thought leadership as kind of an indicator of the caliber of thinking they're going to get from an organization, and that they really want companies that are kind of laying out a vision for the future. So I would say it doesn't always have to be right, and even when you're talking about the future, you're not always going to be right, but to have a clear point of view, to have some bold predictions. That companies are hungry for people who can take a step back and look at the big picture and bring them some ideas that they haven't thought about before, on a time scale they haven't thought about before, at a level of underlying consumer insight. What is it that really makes people tick? What is it that people really want these days? Companies are looking for bold points of view. So if you're going to be a thought leadership person, be bold with your thoughts.
The two takeaways I got there is have thoughts and be bold with them. So thank you. I love that. That's great. So thank you so much for joining us today, Stephen. I appreciate all that you've shared. And I think you've got a really wonderful perspective that lots of folks can extract some themes from and apply in their own work. So thanks so much.
Oh, thanks, Peter. Really appreciate it.
To learn more about Thought Leadership Leverage, please visit our website at thoughtleadershipleverage.com. To reach me directly, feel free to email me at peter@thoughtleadershipleverage.com. And please subscribe to Leveraging Thought Leadership on iTunes or your favorite podcast app to get your weekly episode automatically.